People who have questions, please raise their hands.
I'm a sociology PhD student at Temple, and I only say that because I do some media content analysis on the Mindy Project. And one of the things that I kind of argue is that Mindy positions herself as an honorary white because of the way she situates her interpersonal relationships. And I'm thinking about what we offered, especially what you offered, Sara, around like just the context of the political economy in which these TV shows exist, right? Is that we're just getting in, but at the same time, there's this importance of positionality, there's this importance of allyship, and adding these complex levels, like Mindy Kaling's still a doctor, right? That's the model minority stereotype. So in what ways does her coming on to Hulu now, and then Aziz existing on Netflix, not necessarily on these like other mainstream kind of like media sites in a sense, or network television, like in what way does that allow them freedom to really explore that complexity in a different way, possibly if it does?
That's a really difficult question, and part of the reason why it's difficult is because it's an apples and oranges question. Like, we know when the Mini Project was on Fox, right, we could look at Nielsen ratings to know how many people were watching it. We could look at who was advertising on it to get a sense of who they thought was watching the show. With Netflix doesn't really share that information. They're not making money the same way, right? They don't. The show doesn't make more money if more people watch it. It's their kind of, it's a prestige thing. Like, look, we're producing new shows and kind of, but not in this, it's not as if. Netflix comes on this, when we got the Aziz Ansari show, we got this many more subscribers. That's not, they don't really, so it's kind of a completely different economic model. So it's hard to do that comparison.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I definitely think there's more room for possibility because you're not, especially compared to broadcast television as opposed to cable, right, where you really are, it's also about what advertisers you get during your segment, has everything to do with who they choose to cast and what storylines they allow. In cable, it's more just sort of how many subscribers, but I think that Peter makes a really good point is that we don't know for sure, but I do think that Netflix and Hulu are trying to position themselves as being a little bit more edgy or young and appealing to more people.
And diverse.
And more diverse. And but yeah, I think it's still really early. And so I think this is also a little bit of people testing the waters of how far can we take this, right? And I think that part of what's really exciting about the second season is like, we don't know, unless anyone knows Alan Yang and Aziz Ansari personally, like we actually don't know how far they were, like how much did they hold back from where they wanted to go, and will they step forward in season 2? And the other thing I would say is, he may or may not read bell hooks, but one thing that I really admire about the two of them as a writing team is they do a lot on Reddit. And they interact with people personally a lot. And so like all the research for Modern Love, for Aziz Ansari's book, he did by like putting out questions on Reddit and interacting with hundreds of people that way. And if you go on, him and Alan Yang have questions like where they say, ask us anything about the series and we'll respond to you, and they really interact with their audiences. And so there is also more space through that social media technology than I've ever seen before for them to get pushback. And so part of it is also like, what do we do? And kind of research you're doing, Sheena, but like what do we do to kind of push that conversation to give them the encouragement and the like sort of safety net of like, please take that next step.
They can watch the video of this conversation,
Yeah.
You can send it to them.
Okay, ready for our next question? There's 2 hands over here.
So I find the depiction of Tirunelveli in Netflix really interesting, and the fact that Aziz Ansari is a Tamil Muslim, because I come from a South Indian Christian family. So my question is, do you think as more Asian Americans break into the film industry, you will see more depiction of the smaller communities such as South Indian Christians, Bengalis, or Hmong or Laotians in the American television and streaming services?
I'd like to think so, but I think that that's not for a long time. I think that, you know, the streaming services and to a lesser extent the big networks are taking a gamble on kind of, yeah, as you said, like what they kind of content they can push out. And maybe if this all does really well, what it will show is that people are actually hungering for more nuance, that people want more, you know, deeper things. So like if the next generation of like Master of None can get like a CBS or a Fox green light, then maybe Netflix will start to introduce shows where there's more nuance to the identities of characters, and maybe not just for South Asians, but like for kind of all communities. I don't think that like there are shows that really flesh out like differential aspects of Latino identity yet, or not to, at least to the same extent or with the same audience. Presumably these things exist, but they're not in the channels that cause us to like pay attention and say, oh, hey, this is a big thing. So yeah, I mean, I'd like to think so, but I think we're probably a pretty far ways away from that, unless we start to see like Indian-based media become more of a thing in the States, which I haven't ruled the possibility out of that as India grows, as it's like, it already exports the biggest film system in the world, and maybe that would start to take root in the United States more. I'm not sure. I think that maybe that would maybe precede a more diverse representation of immigrant communities in the United States. But yeah, I'd like to think it's happening. I think that people want the nuance. I think it's just a matter of when it's going to come.
Yeah, I would just say when I said earlier about the wide spectrum, that's kind of what I meant, right? It's like right now we just want a South Asian man on television, and then like how do we then expand what that the different variations of people's identities and experiences. The other thing I would say though is we're also in this exciting moment, and I know in every new wave of technology, especially in the film world, people say, well, this is what's going to change and democratize the medium. But I am hopeful right now in this era of web series, being like if people are able to produce their own content and market themselves, and make web series, that we're seeing an increasing number of instances where web series that are independently made, if they can prove that there's enough an audience, then get funded at a larger level. And so Issa Rae is a great example of that, Fitness Adventures of an Awkward Black Girl, and there's several others out there, but I think that there's also a place of like, if you're a media maker and you are a minority among a minority, like tell your story and build that story out there, because maybe there's possibility.
Yeah, I don't have much to add, but I just to say that who's producing and who's directing makes all the difference in this conversation. And I just think about Mira Nair as like, Mississippi Masala, like 1991, and how complex and interesting that story is. And
one of the only examples of, yeah.
Absolutely, it's one of the...
immigrant identity is related to blackness in America.
100%, and like you got Uganda as a part of that story. So that is a complex story of the migration experience for Indians, right? Or South Asians more broadly. So I think that says that there's a possibility, depending on who's the director and how conscious they are of these things, right? And The Namesake is, I love The Namesake. I wept during The Namesake, it was like so powerful for me. So like those things do exist, and it will on TV too at some level. It's just about who's producing and directing. Like M. Night Shyamalan exists, but he's making these terrible movies, like it matters that he's doing that at some level.
Made terrible movies so other people wouldn't have to.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things that made my heart flutter was the fact that I'm seeing a brown person like be sexualized, like have sex, and also be in love, which is like really great, especially because I've like had the privilege of like being in that experience and being in an interracial relationship. And I remember the first thing I ever saw that like opened my eyes to that experience in general was Mississippi Masala. So my question is a simple one, which is where can I get more of that? It's really great.
Are you asking specifically for more love stories of black-brown love, or? Gotcha.
Being in love, but there's really like not that much of it out there.
Well, why are you passing it
I
to
don't know
me?
because I don't know.
You just gotta make that. I think that's the answer. You just make that story you want to see, and then we'll all watch it.
There's a kind of bad movie called, I think it's called Catfish and Black Bean.
Black bean sauce.
Yes.
That's really bad.
Yeah, but it's out there.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say also maybe look to independent film festivals, but also there's so many web series out there now from around the world that are, I mean, like there's one that I love that is it's first generation or second generation Chinese women in Australia, and who are all roommates, and it's hilarious. It's called Flat 3, I believe. Does anyone know which one I'm talking about? Anyways, there's stuff from all over the world that we don't even hear about in the US that I think has really amazing and entertaining and meaningful stories.
Yeah, I guess I just want to say that I totally agree with you. It is so nice to see like a unhealthy looking brown man who's still desirable, you know, like with a pot belly and like hairy and like what you don't expect to be beautiful. It's like so great, you know. That's what we want. Like men have body image issues too, so like I think for sure I totally agree.
I mean, I can't answer the question of where you'd find. I think you found it. I don't think there is that much more out there. And I echo everything else about producing it. But I mean, what I hear behind that question is, you know what your experience is, and you know that it's not being reflected back at you by the mainstream media. You still know what your experience is. So why is it important to us? It is important to us. Why is it important to us that the mainstream media reflect it back to us? At a certain level, it's because I know it, but maybe I don't fully know it, or I think I'm wrong because it's not being mirrored back to me. And part of it, I think, is, well, I know this, but I want I want other people to know this, right? So it's not just that Aziz Ansari is making things up, but I know white people who are watching this show, and they might be affected by that. Or I know an African American who saw Mississippi Masala, and maybe they'll think about, maybe they'll, whatever it is. So with it's I have no doubt that it affects us individually, psychologically, to have what we know are completely wrong, retrograde, inaccurate media representations out there that don't fit with what we know. And I think part of the reason why I'm a media scholar is because of this paradox. It's like, well, if we know what's wrong, then why do we, why do we give it that power? Because I don't think it just is powerful, and we need to. I think we give it that power. And again, I'm not criticizing us. I think it's a natural thing for us to do. So it's that dynamic of wanting to see a story, and part of what's motivating it is that you want other people to see it, or at least the possibility that other people might see it.
So I'm going to be the annoying person. I have 2 comments and 1 question. But I did want to say that with the Netflix model versus network television, they are tracking the views, and they're actually using that data to create shows. So like they know that people like certain kinds of comedies, or they know that they like, romantic comedies, or, they know that they like Marvel, so that's why they're creating these things. So I don't think we should think that our viewership of those things is passive and doesn't matter, because it does. So like if Master of None doesn't come back, or if something that you're watching doesn't come back, the reason Mindy is on Hulu is because there was a campaign for people to keep that show on some kind of television. So I think we should be really careful about like what we're watching. And I know for myself, I'll put things on and leave, and we shouldn't do that because then we're like picking up the wrong shows. The other thing about the class privilege, Ravi Patel said in an article that he had argued with Aziz about the accents, because it was a privilege not to have to do accents. And I think that we think about people of color playing thugs and all the kinds of wrong stereotypical roles. You have to have a certain amount of income to turn down a role.
Yeah.
And I think that's something also that maybe that he can get into that, since his character is a working actor, to kind of think about that part of the class thing. My question was, so I know most of you, except for Peter, and I'm not talking about you necessarily, but I know people in this room, people hate the Mindy Project, and they love this show. And I was just wondering why. Like, what is it? Not to make them, they're apples and oranges in form, obviously, but in terms of being, wanting to see people who look like you or similar to you or reflect your experience, why the show over Mindy?
I don't hate the Mindy Project. I took a stab at it before just because I thought it was funny, but I mean, I don't particularly like it because I'm kind of sick of the whole like, oh, everyone's a terrible person on a comedy and somehow everything's fine at the end of every episode thing. Like the like It's Always Sunny thing, the kind of the Seinfeld thing to a lesser extent. I would argue like the Parks and Rec or The Office thing, where it's like you have these characters that are just like malicious and mean and say things that are just like nasty and sometimes like racist or homophobic or whatever. And it's just like, oh, this is how it goes. I think it's just tired and kind of boring, and it's like fake edginess, but I don't think there's much substance behind it. So I find shows where it's a little bit more like, I like Master of None because I don't think that that's there so much. Even when people do those kinds of jokes in that show, you get the sense like, oh, these are characters who are friends with camaraderie. I don't get that from the Mindy Project, and it just kind of, I leave episodes being like, why should I care about these people?
Yeah, it's tricky, and I'm actually really interested in Sheena's research on the Mindy Project because I have such a complicated relationship, because full disclosure, she's totally my fashion icon. So, and really actually it's her stylist more than her, so maybe it's not even her, maybe she doesn't deserve the credit, but, and there is something affirming about seeing a full-figured woman on TV, like there's a lot of things that have been meaningful for me watching the Mindy Project, and also just she's someone who started very young on The Office and was one of the first, she's one of the few women writers to really excel on that show, and then also to eventually be able to direct a few episodes. And so there's a lot I admire about her career path and what she's been able to do for herself. I think that for me, the difference between the shows is really actually the form in some ways, is that not just the sort of cynicism that you're working on, but the Mindy Project is still doing a little bit more of a formulaic comedy form, whereas I think that Master of None, some people I know were disappointed by it because they really wanted something that felt more like Parks and Rec, right? That had that pacing and storytelling structure. And I really like that this has a lot more breathing room. It's not a joke every 10 seconds. And I think that he's very both him and Alan Yang are very optimistic in a way that most comedy isn't right now. And there's something very sweet about Master of None that has a kind of realness that we don't see in general, but then also particularly from men. I'm very interested in men expressing softness and sweetness and how that challenges our concepts of masculinity, and I think that the show does that really beautifully in some ways, though I'd like to see a little more.
Thanks for asking the unspoken question that everybody was thinking. And I want to thank everybody for having this conversation because you asked it, I hadn't quite put my finger on what exactly I think is going on. So, but from what everybody's saying, I think the fact that Mindy Kaling's show is, it's explicitly playing with the conventions of romantic comedy, right? Like the first episode in particular does that, but it's explicitly, and in general, we don't pay as much respect to something that is very clearly within a genre, right? Even though you can innovate within a genre too, but it feels like, so that you were saying that some of now the flip side is you're saying that Masters of None is more clearly original, but there's a risk to that too, because some people don't find it legible, they don't understand it because it's not working within that kind of vocabulary of that we're familiar with. So, but critically, I think we have a bias against it, and I think we have a bias against a woman's genre. Romantic comedy is a woman's genre. So it doesn't seem like it could be doing as much politically, even though obviously it could be incredibly political. And so I think that bias, some of it reflects those kind of unstated assumptions about the relationship between gender and storytelling.
Hey, real quick in defense of M. Night Shyamalan. If we have an Indian filmmaker who's making terrible films in America and he's still getting work, we've come a long way. I'm just going to say that. Thanks. Just tell you like it is. I know I'm going to get work too. It's going to be fantastic. So, hi. My question to the panel, I wanted to tell you about something that's authentic to my experience, and then I would like each of you to give me an answer to this question that's authentic to your experience. So there seems to be this persistent groundswell of support for Idris Elba as James Bond. And what's authentic to my experience is that I don't care, because James Bond will never be an Indian or Asian man. And also, James Bond is like this super like British colonial construct that's still trying to like conquer the world. Like, but that sort of narrative is not very popular. So my question to the panel is, do you care if James Bond is ever a person of color, and why?
There's a part of me that's like on your side. It's like I grew up in like predominantly white suburb of Hartford, Connecticut. You know, almost all my friends growing up, if not all of them, were white. I've always kind of defined my identity as a South Asian person with relationship to whiteness. But I used to play in like bands with friends and stuff, and friends were into like punk rock and punk rock kind of indie ethos. And the thing that always kind of stuck with me right up until I started to like understand the nuance of pop culture was like this kind of punk rock ideal of like the status quo is no good. Everything that's popular is messed up and problematic, and if you want things that you actually like are good and push things like the culture forward, you gotta look below the surface. And which made me think like that things like James Bond thing is like kind of rather insignificant. I mean, I think that when people make those decisions in Hollywood, it's not always about us. It's about, well, what do white people, what can they handle? What can a white audience handle? And like, I think that that's, in that respect, like even if I didn't care, that's still significant because someone else, like a white person, is seeing Idris Elba as James Bond. And that to me seems like a very significant change in the society regardless of what I think. You know, hopefully there'd be people of color out there who think like, or like, you know, young men of color who are like looking at this and being like, oh my God, like the possibilities are kind of limitless. But I will say that something that was very influential in my life was seeing Aziz Ansari on his first show, MTV's Human Giant, which I loved. And, you know, it was a show that he did with other comedians, Paul Scheer, Rob Huebel, total screwball show that, you know, I really loved it. And to me that was like a really significant thing because I was like, here's a guy who's not like dovetailing in the stereotypes, who's doing something really funny in the company of far more established white comedians. I remember a friend who went to college in Brooklyn telling me that he used to go to Upright Citizens Brigade Theater in like Lower Manhattan and see their live show there. And he was like, you know, very much like a fish out of water as like this brown guy, like, you know, New York University undergrad. But that's powerful, I think, because you can envision yourself in certain things. So even if it's like not significant, or even if it's like a product that you don't like, because that's a problematic like heritage, I mean, you can kind of turn off, but it's still there in the pop culture, and I think that its incorporation is rather significant and important.
Yeah, I really love this question. Because my instinct at the beginning was to be like, fuck James Bond, right? Like, that's the first thing I wanted to do. But then I started thinking about it, and I was like, well, you know, there's a lot of money attached to that franchise, right? And there's a political economy, and a lot of people watch that. And so there's a lot more at stake, I feel like, than just like me wanting to like disown James Bond. And in that sense, I would really very much like to see a person of color as James Bond, because people are going to watch that. And a lot of people, and I think it goes back to what you were just saying, you know, a lot of people are going to watch that, including me, because I watched 10 James Bonds, right? So like, of course I'm going to watch the next James Bond, probably, right? So yeah, in that sense, I think it does matter, and I think it does matter because of just the reach and because of the amount of money that goes into that production.
My answer would be really short, which is that, you know, as I've stated, my agenda is that I want to widen the spectrum, and if we want to widen the spectrum, we have to widen the spectrum, and so I would like to see people of all kinds of backgrounds and all kinds of different roles.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating question, and I mean, to me, what it highlights is why is James Bond even still around? Right? Because he's so specifically, I mean, he's a Cold War character who has somehow outlived the Cold War, and
There's always a new enemy, though.
yeah, but there's this
Right.
there's a new enemy, and and the thing that was always cool about him, but also weird about him, was like, yeah, a British secret agent could be really important in the world. You know, it's kind of like, the very fact that right now, like I grew up on James Bond. I love James Bond. I like the Daniel Craig James, but to me, the Daniel Craig James Bond, even though I really like him, and but I'm kind of like, it has nothing to do with. Nominally he's in a tuxedo, but it doesn't have, part of what made James Bond is that he was suave and goofy, right? And kind of, whereas, he's not Jason Bourne happening to wear a tuxedo, right? It's something different. So the very fact that they're trying to make him more like Jason Bourne is already a sign that James Bond, kind of classic James Bond, his time is done. His time is done. So the only way from a money standpoint is, yes, they would have to do something completely radical, like change him and make him Idris Elba. But then of course it wouldn't be James Bond anymore, except in the sense that they have this factory to produce this product. It's like they're changing Barbie dolls. Right?
Yeah.
Barbie dolls are going to change their. That's amazing, and obviously I'm all for that, but at a certain level, they're not Barbie dolls anymore.
I just remember Star Wars, and I feel like the same thing comes up in that context as well, and it did matter, right?
Yeah.
And there's a lot of discussion about it, and I just have to confess that I'm getting answers fed from the crowd, and one thing that has come up in this kind of eye contact thing is we're talking about James Bond as a brown or black man, but what about a brown or black woman who's a James Bond, right? Like, we didn't even think of that. That was in my consciousness when you asked that question, but I feel like...
I said person of color, I didn't say that.
Yeah, and I think I just immediately went to, like, brown man, right, or black man, and I think that does matter to this conversation. I think it does matter to the franchise and whether it does change at all, and what it keeps, as it changes.
It reminds me of similar conversations about superheroes,
Yeah.
about changing the color of the superheroes, because many of them are also relics of bygone era.
And Jessica Jones is right there.
Hello, I'm a sophomore double majoring in film and media arts and IT at Temple University, and hearing all of you speak about Master of None, one of my new favorite shows as a brown man studying filmmaking, it was absolutely amazing. My question is, I remember Aziz Ansari talked about it on the show a little bit, how African Americans are just getting to the point where a sitcom can star two African American males, but it can't happen with an Indian sitcom. And I'm also thinking about how brown people have allied with the white people because the education is there, and education, if you grew up in like a brown or Asian family, education is like a big deal. It's not so big a deal for African Americans, from what I can tell in the media. It is a big deal, but it hasn't represented as much. Usually African Americans, Kendrick Lamar just won Best Rap Album at the Grammys for saying that every black person is portrayed as an entertainer or an athlete or something else in some way. You don't see many black surgeons, but you see a lot of Indian surgeons in media. Would it be a good idea to like flip-flop and have more Indian entertainers on screen and have more black surgeons on screen? What do you think about that? Just like change that stereotype altogether.
Inhaled first.
Yeah, I'm not, again, that was really deep, I'm not sure I understood all I'm kind of thinking through the implications of what you're saying. With stereotypes, you can't just turn a stereotype over and then it becomes okay. You can't just, when you turn Fu Manchu over, it becomes Charlie Chan. That doesn't make it positive, When you turn the evil guy who wants to dominate the world over and he becomes a helpful, cooperative guy, they're both problematic, right? And the logic of just taking a stereotype and turning it over and just making James Bond a woman or making him black or look, a black surgeon, it's in the late seasons of I'm gonna out myself, it's a different kind of nerd, of Star Trek: The Next Generation, and in the movies, they constantly, whenever they contacted Starfleet Command, right, they constantly had women as admirals. They had, you know, they had black men out, you know, in all these, but they weren't so in theory they would be like, oh, look how progressive we are. We have these people, but people in positions of color. But narratively, those weren't people who were important at all, right? It's still Jean-Luc Picard that's important, right? So just making the doctor a surgeon doesn't, an African-American character a surgeon doesn't do it. Now giving him a rich inner life and a complicated relationships. Yeah, I mean, that's where I mean, this is kind of the class question in another way. It's kind of like, don't just take a minor person and give them a respected job and think, okay, now we're done. No, let's see what's messy about their lives, right? I mean, for whatever you think about like Scandal and How to Get Away with Murder, those shows aren't interesting because they took a black woman and put her into an important role. They're interesting because they took a black woman with a hugely messy life and foregrounded her in that way.
And just to quickly build off of that, I mean, I think like having characters with agency is really important. So the fact that, I mean, you were talking about like this depiction of African Americans in media as like not, as education not being important. I mean, there are people that think that about African Americans in the world, and it's disastrous for our society. So I mean, to have like characters with agency that maybe despite circumstances can like exercise agency within those circumstances, contributing to the narrative of a rich inner life, that's more important than any kind of like, well, you put a, you know, you swap out the color and then swap out the education like it's like a, what was the thing that Father was playing with? An abacus?
Yeah.
Like, yeah. I mean, I don't know if I got how that thing works, right? But what's point is like weird ass
One thing,
toy,
you don't hold it this way, you hold it that way.
Fair enough. Who says? But yeah, I mean, I think like having characters with like people of color in shows with agency is really more important to me than putting them in any kind of role. I'd rather see a show that shows like, you know, a black person in a gang who still has a rich inner life than just like the surgeon who is kind of popping up every now and then with like little quips that doesn't have much of a development. To me, that's a more interesting story. It's more uplifting. I can't answer that question, but I think that I personally think it's like more important and more significant for people to watch.
Yeah, great. What Sameer said.
Yeah, there's also this kind of like discourse about, you know, Indians and Asians, they really care about education and that's why, you know, they've succeeded, right? Like that myth is just that myth. Who doesn't care about education, right? Who doesn't like, that doesn't make any sense to anybody, right? If you just think about it for 10 seconds, right? Everybody cares about education. There's a history there, and telling that history of why the Indian folks in the United States have a higher level of education as a general rule. That's what we need to talk about, I think, before we even get into, before we even get into media and film, we need to have that conversation, because that's like the history of us in this country, right? So that's what I would say to you, like, learn that history, we should all learn that history, and that would help us understand this education myth.
All right, thank you very much. A big round of applause for our panel.